Benny Goforth, representing the Arkana Community Center members, invited me to come and talk with their group about the history of Arkana. Without question, those that live in that community were more familiar with the history of the community than I am, but for some reason or other they invited me. And their commitment to history and the preservation of history is indicated by the fact that people from the community went to the time, effort, and expense in 1993 of restoring and remodeling the old Arkana School, which lays claim to being the oldest school still standing in Baxter County. And so that's good. Their interest is further reflected in the fact that they have a collection of memorabilia in photos and objects which Arkana folks have collected over the years, and is displayed on the walls of the schoolhouse down there. So it's really a kind of a mini museum besides being used as a community gathering place. Now, do we have anybody from Arkana here tonight?
I started school there.
You did? At that school?
At that school.
Well, maybe you can tell us how long they held classes there. I can't remember when that stopped.
I don't know. I started first grade there, and in about 3 or 4 months after that, I moved to Wichita.
Oh, okay.
And I was only 4.
Well, you probably won't correct too many of my mistakes then.
I might, but I wouldn't know.
Well, it's a good thing that the people in Arkana went to work to preserve some history, because it isn't easy to hang on to history. This is not only a little bit of a story about Arkana, but this is also a little preachment about preserving history, as you'll see as we go along. It's easy for history to disappear. I wonder if a tornado ever hit Arkana. Hadn't heard of one. That would have taken the history away. But I was born and lived in Iowa until I was 9, and my family moved to Baxter County. And among my few Iowa memories was hearing about tornadoes that would come up around the state and hit the towns and communities in different places and wreak some havoc. I never saw a tornado myself, but I have seen the aftermath of a number of them. But I do remember my mom one day showing me a newspaper photo that looked something like this. Notice the bottom right corner of the photo of Tornado Rebel. Margaret Mitchell's famous book leaves an ironic message about the situation in the picture. Of course, that's not the actual picture my mom showed me. I kind of used some technology to put that together. But it looked just like that, and there was her book in the middle of the tornado. Gone with the wind. And so when I think about recapturing history and digging into history, I usually remember this picture. The stuff of our lives, the material things, the events, the interactions, even the people, the history we live, all eventually pass from view. Not with the sudden force of a tornado maybe, but slowly and unrelentingly, so that it can be seen that they're gone with the wind. It vanished as if a small breeze came through and we didn't even notice. One of the most common things I hear about history and digging into history when I have a conversation with people about preserving it is somebody says something like that, well, I wish I had talked to my grandma before, while she was still around, and had her tell me about her life. That happens a lot. We've all had that experience, and then we get to the point where we're the ones that should be talking to the younger people about the history and so on. The feeling of I wish I had thought of it sooner, or I wish I had asked when I had the chance, is something which we've all experienced, because history does have a way of being gone with the wind until we do something about it. So what about Arkana? It takes a conscious effort in the present to keep the past from disappearing, and for a little shameless plug, that's why we have Baxter County Historical Society and Genealogical Society. Back in 1973, it was created, the centennial year of our county, and we try to preserve all kinds of records from the county, documents, pictures, artifacts, and actual buildings, So what we and people who come along later, so that people who come along later can know and enjoy the history of a beautiful county. And we seek to make these things available to persuade people that take an interest in this heritage, along with their own family history. Now, the folks in Arkana understand that, as shown by what they've done in their community to preserve that kind of heritage. So back to the question, what about Arkana? I started my preparation of these remarks with that question. Now, my first answer, remember this was back in 2015 when I first put this together. My first answer came from my memory. As a teenager growing up out on Walker Road, northwest of the town, Mountain Home, all I knew was that there was a place called Arkana. I would see the word Arkana in a column in the Baxter Bulletin, just as I saw the word Walker in a column in the Baxter Bulletin. And I read the bits and pieces in the Walker News, which were submitted each week in those days by our neighbor Carrie McCumber. I knew what that was like. So I didn't bother to read what was under Arkana, but assumed it had similar bits and pieces from a similar community. Only the names were changed, probably not to protect the innocent, but to identify the guilty. But besides that memory, I had the resources of the Society archives by that time and the Baxter County Library, where we are now, and I had some experience doing research. I knew a little bit about the Arkana School because in 2014 I had put together a PowerPoint version of a slide presentation that was created back in 1985 by that teachers organization, Phi Delta Kappa. And those slides were donated to the library here, and I was volunteering here, and so helped put that together, and I thought, well, it's good to put this in a form where we can still show it. Slide projectors are getting a little bit passé. So anyway, I did that, and it had lots of pictures of the old 1- and 2-room schools of the county. In addition to the slides, interestingly enough, there was a narration and interviews with educators recorded on audio cassette. Remember those? The presentation included a brief account of the Arkana School, including the voice of teacher Connis Keeter. We'll get to that a little later, but right now we'll keep on talking about these earlier times. Arkana School was one of those in that 1985 presentation. And so I had a little information, and this is the photo which was included. So
is there a way to turn down these lights a little bit up here?
It's kind of hard to see.
I'll do that.
Oops.
Fix that.
Oh, that did it.
They're supposed to dim.
Oh, off is okay.
Yeah, off is good.
Off is okay, we still have these.
They aren't dimming.
Yeah, that's not bad.
That's fine.
Well, I have to be able to see my notes, okay?
Memorized? Oh.
I don't have it memorized.
I was assuming you had it memorized there.
Now, I'll plug this back in and hopefully it'll work when it's called for.
Okay.
That's a little better.
We'll do it that way. Is that better?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Now you can't see.
So that we asked again, what about Arkana? In our archives at the Heritage Center, I looked into the indexes of our quarterly Baxter County history to see where Arkana might be mentioned. I was excited to discover that in the issue for April, May, and June 2006, we had reprinted an article about Arkana, which was 100 years old at the time. The author of the article isn't named, but at that time, 1906, it's quite likely to have been Tom Shiras, who was the editor of the Baxter Bulletin, which he had acquired just 2 years earlier in 1904. In any event, the writer starts his description of Arkana as a nice little town. Now, here's the article. I've printed some copies, and they're over on the table, and you can pick those up afterwards and read more of these details, but I'm going to share a little bit of this with you. It says, Arkana, that's the headline, and the subheadline is, a nice little town which promises to make one of the best and richest communities in the county in the next few years, and about people who lived in and around it. I want to read you a little bit of the opening. I'm pretty sure this is Tom Shiras, based on other things I've read by him. As the upriver train leaves Devereaux, the mouth of the North Fork, and whirls along under the big white bluffs and on into the fertile river bottoms above, one looks idly out of the window and across the river at old Matney Knob frowning down on him from that side, and on the other side, above the river bottom farms at the long line of rocky hillsides. The impressions he forms of the country will be varied. If he is one that sees beauty in God's workshop, his eye will be pleased with the ever-changing panorama of the hills and the beautiful white as it crawls along on its way to the Mississippi. However, if one is of a practical turn of mind and has to be shown, let him drop off the train at the station nearest this point and wend his way back toward the long line of rocky hillsides. As he pushes back from the railroad and gets on top of the ridge, the scene changes. Instead of rocks and hillsides, he sees fields of opening cotton, fine cornfields with the big ears breaking from their husks, and many other things that make his eyes open. As he advances further up the road, the houses grow thicker, and he hears the whir of a cotton gin and the screech of a saw. After this, he passes many houses and at last sits down on the porch of the store in Arkana to blow. And then that introduction concludes over here with something that's interesting in describing the town of Arkana. He had some other things in between, but he said, things grew slowly. Occasionally, some new man would drop in and another until we find it now, Arkana now, one of the most prosperous and well-settled parts of the county. It boasts of 2 good stores conducted by Swearingen and Bomer and R.O. Rouse, a sawmill with a capacity of 5,000 feet of lumber a day, and a cotton gin that turned out 105 bales this past season. The mill and gin are owned by R.A. Rouse Sr., and they are running nearly all the time. It goes on and says, of course, farming is the chief industry. But you might find this little article and the people it names interesting to pick up over there. But it's interesting that he starts out by calling Arkana a nice little town. It's 1906, it's viewed as a town, or at least a community that's well on its way to becoming a town. How many of you know where Arkana is? Just about everybody knows where it is. But we drive down there now and we don't think too much about town.
No.
2 big landmarks along the highway, the schoolhouse and the Baptist church. That's kind of what we see. You can venture off a little bit and see some other things, but we'll do that in a minute. So since I don't have any personal knowledge, I had to find out some things about Arkana by research. And as a researcher, I appreciated a comment I ran across from another source. Not sure who. It might have been Tom Shiras too. But it emphasizes that one of the things you first have to do when you're going to preserve history is to collect it. Look at these comments. That's Arkana Landing there, by the way. The men who blazed the track of civilization, the pioneers of Baxter County, are passing away. The hills that once echoed back the crack of their unerring rifles will know them no more. Thrilling stories, stories that would be read with rapturous interest, could be written of their early experiences here. Before it is too late, the notes for this future history of Baxter County should be gathered up and preserved. If opportunity were given, the venerable pioneers of this county would furnish these notes. Beyond the early article I discovered, I began to research whatever notes I could provided by the venerable pioneers. And I first explored in those community columns in the Baxter Bulletin. But you know, you can run the Baxter Bulletin over here on the microfilm and find out whatever you need to, which is what I did. Whoever was writing for Arkana in those days called that column Arkana Accidents. And notice I've got the date June 9, 1902. That's the first one I looked at. And accidents here means happenings, not mishaps. But however, the first one for June 9, 1902 happened to report on an actual accident. Uncle Dick Thrasher, who fell upon the ice and injured his hip, is confined to his room and is recovering very slowly. Since he fell on the ice, I guess in June, that was a while back. He's still recovering.
And he's still
Still recovering.
Yeah.
Next one said, timely May showers have encouraged the farmers and they are all busy cleaning out their corn, getting ready for the next rain. And then here's Mrs. Thrasher, who has been very sick. The Thrashers are having problems. Is convalescent. She's getting well. That's good news. We also read that preaching at the Arkana church last Sunday was by Elder Will Hensley. And it says that Mr. Rouse, who had his foot amputated a short time ago, is getting along nicely. So we're kind of having some Arkana accidents, I guess. And then, you know, this is June, and they've just gone through spring, and the gardens are in, so the next one said this. The bill of fare in this neighborhood is as follows. First course, mustard greens. Second course, onions and lettuce. Radishes for dessert. Everybody expecting to have green peas by next Sunday.
Radishes for dessert.
And then here's one that's pretty interesting. That was at the same time. The Ozark Queen came up to Bomer's Landing last Saturday evening with a full load of freight.
Wow.
And this was printed in June 9th, 1902. And this item in Arkana Accidents references the arrival of that steamboat. Picture is in the archive of the University of Arkansas Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture. I got it from them, used it by permission. We have copies of it in our archives already. But getting back to history, the Queen came to Bomer's Landing in 1902. You remember I mentioned the gentleman by the name of Bomer earlier. This is a picture of the Ozark Queen, but this location is not likely Bomer's Landing, Arkana Landing. From looking at it across the river there, I'd be inclined to say it's probably Buffalo City.
That's what I thought.
With the Buffalo, the confluence of the Buffalo coming in on the other side there. And so anyway, this steamboat, if you can look at it close, displays Memphis on its stern as its home port. So this is one that plied up and down the Mississippi, and when it was possible, came up the White River. It was one of the last ones to come up into Baxter County after the railroads got here. I do think I read an account of it landing at Buffalo City in 1910, maybe. But anyway, in the account of the Bomer family in this book, History and Families of Baxter County, which the Society brought out in 2003, it tells this. During the rainy months, when the river ran full and fast, steamboats brought manufactured goods to the area. They returned downriver loaded with feed, cotton, apples, lumber, shingles, and other products of the local economy. In the summer, flat-bottom keel boats plied the river, and that account in this book was written by Tom and Frances Bomer, some of the descendants in the Bomer family. As a side note, we know that the extensive use of steamboats on the White would soon come to an end with the completion of the White River Railroad between 1903 and 1905, and that greatly affected Baxter County and also made a big difference in Arkana. And the railroad effectively put the steamboats out of business, at least on a smaller river like the White. Well, anyway, speaking of Bomer's Landing, here's James Bethel Bomer, a pioneer of the Arkana community. He was born in 1852 in Trigg County, Kentucky. He and Laura Jeanette Shoggon were married in 1874, before they came over here, and emigrated to here from Kentucky in 1878 with an infant son, Willie Howard Bomer. They settled in Gobbler's Flat, which is an old name for Arkana, Gobbler's Flat. We saw from the last slide that the Ozark Queen steamboat would have pulled ashore into Bomer's Landing, so that was connected with this family, and James operated that landing, the steamboat freight that came through there. The landing has been described as being on the White River across from Mount Matney. And James also had a store and a warehouse, and the landing was a bustling part of Arkana, according to the account in that book. James Bomer's steamboat landing was the site of a family tragedy about 1902. This is described in Mary Ann Messick's Centennial History of Baxter County. After the steamboat Myrtle had been unloaded by local young men and cast off, quote, "The river looked inviting for a swim, but it was running swift and dangerous. Mr. Bomer warned the boys as he paid them to stay out of the river. Some older boys, including Willie Howard Bomer, stayed behind, and when his father left, they dove into the river. Willie, barely 14 years old, was pulled down by an undertow and drowned. His grave is the oldest in Arkana Cemetery." History is really nothing more than the continuing story of life and death. James Bomer's brother was David Monroe Bomer. Here he is pictured with his family, and this is a 1909 photo. I think that this is probably David right here, if you can see my cursor, and that's probably his wife there, and their extended family. I'm guessing about those identifications, but that looks likely from the picture. Anyway, this is an important picture, and that's probably why it was used in the book I've already referred to as a divider spread between regular history and the family histories that are included in here. Same photo. It's quite interesting. Anyway, according to the account of June Ahrens in this book, David Monroe Bomer and his wife Mary Rebecca Swearingen moved from Kentucky to Baxter County about 1880. And some other facts I'm going to give you a little bit of discrepancy in the dates about when they came, but different family members wrote different versions of the history, so around that time. Ahrens writes, members of the Robertson, Shoggon, and Swearingen families, who were related to the Bomers through marriage, had moved to Baxter County earlier. It can be concluded that they encouraged their relatives to join them. And of course that was a common pattern in the pioneer days. She says David and Mary Rebecca, quote, settled in Arkana. He was engaged in various enterprises of his brother J.B., including managing his apple orchard. David Rouse and his brother James were two of the sons of Richard Rouse. There are two accounts of Richard Rouse and his family. There we see them, and I'm assuming that is Richard right there. This is the father of the two brothers that we're talking about. And it says, in the History and Family book, there are many details about Richard and his wife, Louisa Wells Rouse. And they came to the county in 1884, it says, with their 10 children, aged from a few months to 18 years. And one account calls Richard a prominent businessman and states, quote, about the year 1890, Richard bought a cotton gin and grist mill, which was set up about a half mile south of the Arkana post office on the Rouse farm and operated them for several years along with the sawmill. The cotton gin turned out about 105 bales a season. They brought lots of cotton and shipped some by steamboat from Bomer's Landing. That's descendants of the Bomers writing these things. Rouse also got a contract with the White River Railroad in 1901 and 1902 to clear some of the railroad roadway because it was just being built in those years. And in this well-known picture, which I just snapped from a poor copy that hangs on the wall down there at the Arkana Schoolhouse, is the Richard A. Rouse sawmill. I've cleaned it up a little bit, but notice that it's colored. It wasn't originally a colored picture, but somebody colored it, which was done some in those times, you know. But anyway, that's featured in the book and also in Mary Ann Messick's book. So it goes on to say, this is about the Rouse sawmill, which is a very productive operation in the good timberland of the area, and Richard's biographer states, Richard was one of the many pioneer businessmen in the Arkana area who knew the benefits of leveraging to prosper in ranching, farming, lumber, and cotton production. So they engaged in multiple enterprises. There are other significant families which can be mentioned, of course, and one I should mention, I mentioned Benny Goforth at the beginning. Benny grew up there, you'll see him in a minute, but his father Warren Goforth was the county surveyor, and his father John Goforth was also the county surveyor. Anyway, other significant families, and here's a significant one. This is not a document or a story, but a historical structure, and of which we have many that are slowly disappearing in Baxter County and many that have already disappeared. When I asked Benny if I could see it and take some pictures, I was surprised to learn that it was his family's home in later years of Arkana. But it had been originally owned by the Bomers. Probably one of the Bomers built it, but I don't know which one. You can still go down and see it. It's still standing. But anyway, he said it was built about 1887, about 3 years before the schoolhouse was built, in his reckoning. It was bought from the Bomers by Benny's grandfather, John Goforth, and passed to his father, Warren. That's a large house which became even larger over time. I was attracted by this front window and its cornice, which seems to me almost like a symbol of pioneer Arkana and the aspirations of the settlers who came in there. Benny took me for a walk around the house, pointing out various features, so for a few slides we'll walk around it together. Like many pioneer houses and cabins, as families grew, the structures grew, and so we see an add-on on the back of the house here. And then there's a corresponding connection to the house that's collapsing in this picture, slowly sagging down. Benny Goforth slept here, my guide reports. And it was sometimes pretty chilly, he said, in sleeping quarters with snow creeping through the window sash. On the other side, a long porch must have been a good place to sit on a summer day, summer evening. And it had access to the addition and the main house. The fireplace chimney of the main part of the house is on the northwest side. Just take a look at that and those big stones that are all cut there to go in there. So whether they cut them themselves or had them shipped in on the steamboat, I don't know. The industrious construction of the pioneer families is something to be marveled at, though. This is a truly impressive historic structure, but like many, resources are lacking to preserve it for later generations to see. It's to be hoped, or at least I hope, that somebody will research and write down the history of this house in detail and collect many more photos, including finding pictures of it from the times it was lived in. Probably Benny ought to be the one doing that. But anyway, as we say when we see something like this, if only walls could talk. Walls can't, but people can, and that's how some of history gets preserved. Well, right now I'm going to share a few more early Arkana news items from the Baxter Bulletin. And these help to go on giving us a flavor of the people who lived in the houses around here. Speaking of steamboats and railroads, well, we did a little while ago. Let's return to some of the bits of Arkana news. This is still from 1902, when railroad construction along the White River there was just beginning, and it started down in Batesville, and it was making its way up to Norfolk and Arkana and so on. So we read, Mrs. Miller says, since we are to have a railroad, hatching chickens with an old hen is too slow for as fast a country as this will be, so she's trying an incubator.
Good.
Pretty good.
French that out.
I furnished the picture of the chicken free. Several young people from this vicinity went to Salem Baptist Church last Sunday to witness the foot washing ceremony, but were disappointed as it was postponed until the first Sunday in August. Now, what does that make you wonder? June to August, no foot washing? Well, a religious foot washing is different than the daily. Seems like quite a while though to go with dirty feet. Here's a little more somber one. Died at her home at the old Beatty farm, April 28th. Mrs. Rachel Ann Beatty, familiarly known as Aunt Ann Beatty. Mrs. Beatty was born in Middle Tennessee in 1833 and was 69 years of age at the time of her death, which would be this year. She had lived in this neighborhood for many years, was a member of the Christian church, was highly respected by all her friends and acquaintances. That obituary goes on to say she leaves 3 children, Mrs. Jack Hand, Mrs. Joe Moody, and Mr. Sam Beatty, and several grandchildren to mourn her loss. She had been in failing health for a number of years and at last succumbed to the inroads of that dread disease, consumption. Pneumonia, tuberculosis. And it goes on, we read that funeral exercises were conducted by Elder Will Henley at the Arkana Cemetery. That picture of the Arkana sign is another little piece of history. It was taken by Vera Reeves in September 1999. Vera was a great Baxter County history researcher, and even when I was living in California and doing genealogy, I'd email back and forth with Vera, and she would give me information about, not my family, I'm not from here, but my wife's family. She knew a lot about it. We have some of her records at the Heritage Center to be used in the future by all of you serious researchers, or just by the curious. Anyway, she's an example of the kind of person that keeps history from being gone with the wind. Well, let's change the date and look at a few more bits here. But before we leave this date, I'll note that at the bottom of the Arkana accidents column was the identity of the reporter. You know who?
Oh.
Do you know who? And, I'm not sure anybody does anymore.
That's good.
In those days, they would have known.
They probably did.
Yeah. Well, we'll move up to June 30th, 1911. Fishing and pearling are the chief occupations here at present. Lots of pearls were taken out of the White River. Still are once in a while. But in these days, in the early 1900s, a lot of that was going on. And this one goes with it. We note in a recent issue of the Bulletin that George Smothers had found a pearl in the White River as large as a quail's egg. Wow. This is a mistake. It turned out to be a turtle's egg.
Oh.
A few more. T.H. Henley made his return from Little Rock on the 11th, and on the 12th he picked up a cotton hoe and showed us he still knew how to use it. I guess the idea was maybe he became too much of a city slicker going to Little Rock. Mrs. Dolly Rouse and son visited friends and relatives in Mountain Home on Saturday and Sunday. Just stop and think for a minute the effort that would be required in those days to go from Arkana to Mountain Home. Another one, Mr. J.M. Ware, who'd been in the employment of Nicholas Sharp and Sons Grocer Company of St. Louis, has resigned his position with that firm, and we understand has accepted a position with H.H. Gallup. So they were keeping up with news about Arkana people who've gone on to other places. Whoops. Some of the boys from this place went to Mountain Home Friday to see the show.
Well, that's big.
Well, I wonder, there wasn't a movie theater in Mountain Home in 1911.
What would that have been then?
Well, I do know that Melvin Finley, who did the theater in Norfolk, would go around with a projector and films to different places
Oh.
Yeah,
and
I
show them.
remember
And
him saying
at one
that.
time, he showed some films inside our courthouse in Mountain Home. Which courthouse it was, I'm not sure. It was probably the one before this one. So, I don't know what show they might have gone to see. We go on just a little bit. Clifford Vickery, in company with his mother and sister, attended church at Shady Grove last Sunday. So they could go a few miles to get to their church. Prof. Alcorn and daughter, Miss Rosa, and Clifford Vickery returned from the Institute at Cotter last week. Who knows what the Institute would be? That was about a twice annual meeting of teachers of the county. They called it the Institute. So probably all three of them were teachers. Either that or Miss Rosa was Clifford's girlfriend, something like that. Come again, JELC. I like to read your good work. It's a mystery to me. Dan Perry and Miss Ida Estes were married last Friday at the residence of Will Vickery. John Goforth officiating. So John, besides being a surveyor, may well have been a justice of the peace. Or maybe he was a preacher or lay preacher, I don't know. But anyway, here's one that's interesting. A new telephone line is being built from Arkana to Beaufort. It was 1911. A number have taken stock in this line, and we understand there is to be a plug board at William Jones, a switchboard. And then school will begin the third Monday in July with Profs. Alcorn and Low Thrasher at the wheel. We predict a good school. Now about the school a little bit. We've been looking at bits of history by going back beyond the turn of the 20th century, and so I talked to some people down there about the school. One great source was Iva Lee Harris Cantrell. She kept a lot of history together. She's not living in the community. She's still alive, but she's moved close to some of her children. But here's a little history that predates even Iva Lee, and I'm going to read this to you. Some residents in the Arkana area are seeking to organize a group to begin restoring the old Arkana schoolhouse. A meeting has been set for 10 a.m. Saturday at the Arkana Baptist Church for anyone wishing to join the group and help with the process of restoration, as well as attempts the group intends to make toward getting the building listed as a historic structure. I talked to some of the folks down there recently. They didn't get it on the historical registry because they made too many changes to it when they refurbished it. They tried, but they didn't qualify. Anyway, this was said by Dennis Cowan, one of the organizers. The old school building is located on Highway 201 next to the Arkana Cemetery. Cowan said he believes the school was built in the late 1800s or early 1900s, and said it was the first school I ever went to. Cowan said others involved in trying to organize the effort are Roy Ferris, Rick Coy, and Ralph Boyd. He said he hopes all persons interested in getting the school back will attend Saturday's meeting. And here's what they were looking at. July 21st, 1993. You see the graffiti, the broken out windows, and there was a long porch all along the front, and you see it falling off and lying against the front of the building, plus all the weeds growing around, which had to be dealt with too. And so, anyway, a few other things about the history of the school. Here's an Arkana school group in 1915. Now, when we go in close on it, you may be able to see that 4 of those people have X's above their heads. Let's see if I can get my mouse. There's one there, here, here, and here, or here, here, and here. And here's what we learn about that. On the back of that picture, it says, Arkana School 1915. The four I have marked are all that I can be sure of. May Wally Spencer, sixth from the right in the top row. Somebody know her?
Yes.
Okay. We'll show it again in a minute. Sixth from the right in the top row, that's May Wally Spencer. And seventh from the right is A. Votaw. Eighth from the right is Minnie Horn, the teacher. And 10th from the right is one of the swearing-ins, not identified. So here's the picture again, and you see them labeled there for you.
Oh my goodness. Was Minnie Horn Jerry Horn's mother?
She could have been, I don't know. Jerry Horn was in school with Jeannie and me, that's why she asked the question. So anyway, then here's another unidentified Arkana school group. We haven't identified any of those kids, but our archives says this is an Arkana school group. This looks like a little later on in time. Not 1915, but later. And then 1938, Arkana school student body when Harmon and Connis Keeter were teaching. Now, there's Harmon up there in the corner.
Yeah. I'll see her.
And all of you know that Harmon later established the Keeter Lumber Company here in Mountain Home and so on. Now, Connis is not in the picture because it says in this note down here that she's taking the picture.
Oh.
All right? But, so anyway, let's listen now to what Connis said about teaching down there.
Harmon and I started teaching at Arkana together.
Was that your first school?
That was my first school, and that was about 37, 38. And we went down there to a two-room school, and we taught 6 years there altogether. But we taught our first 4 years, the two of us, for $85 a month.
You mean not each?
No, the two of us. The two of
Now,
us.
that building was where the cemetery is at Arkana.
It's still there, it still has, and they had the two rooms, and then in the two rooms, they had a stage that went all the way across. And on in the front of each room, they had two
This is
recitations.
not in Arkana school, I just threw this one in.
And so in the, when we'd have a program or something, there was a petition between the two rooms that could be raised. It was just partially raised. Could be raised, and so you could have a program and everybody
Yes,
could
we're
come.
actually in the old Shady Grove School.
But we taught there. I had the first 4 grades, and he had the other 4 grades.
I just wanted to have some images to kind of cover over the audio there. There we see the school in 1980. In the newspaper picture, it was 1993. We can see that it's a little bit more intact in 1980, but still, you know, falling into ruins. And so, they had to deal with that. Overgrown and dilapidated. This is the 1993 picture again. It was on its way to ruin, and that's when some folks decided that shouldn't happen, and the community came together. Now, today, here are some members of the Arkana Community Center Board that I met with a couple or 3 weeks ago. Going from right to left, we've got Benny Goforth, Roy Ferris, Abitha Southard Hughes die. And there's Harold and Mary Ann Hughes and Ella Hughes, and they're members of the board down there now. And they told me that some other current members are Elton Maynard and Gwen Maynard. I don't know if any of you know those folks. Now earlier we saw Roy Ferris' name mentioned in the Baxter Bulletin article about the school, Roy Ferris' mother was the one who wished the school could be restored, and the idea grew, and so that group of citizens got together in July 1993 at Arkana Baptist, and these folks told me it was a pretty big crowd that came together. And quite a few were there, and local families began the work with their own private donations. They started pooling their money and doing this. And this led to a remodeled kitchen and digging a new well. I was interested to find that the second well that was dug down there was dug by my brother-in-law, Gus Burden. But anyway, there were some stories, interesting stories, that they didn't bother to tell me about the removal of the outdoor bathroom and when a new bathroom was put inside the schoolhouse. So these are just a few shots of the restoration going on back at that time. And that led to a remodeled kitchen and the other things. Along the way, they incorporated and applied for the first grant in 2010 through the county court that helped replace the roof, and in 2014 another helped add heating and cooling. But here in 1994 they had just gotten that far. See the new porch all back on there. The roof hasn't been replaced yet, and so they did it.
Yeah.
Look at that. Over the years, both before and after the restoration, this building has been used for funerals, family reunions, church meetings, 4-H meetings, and other kinds of events. Look at what they achieved. Today there's a monthly community gathering, and in the summers there's a gathering on Saturdays for a potluck and open music, a jam session. And the board's thinking about maybe they need to do some bingo. Another important aspect of historical preservation is the history of the Arkana cemeteries, still well kept and in use. The Society has records of the early burials at Arkana, and that record, of course, is being updated now as we come into the digital age with things like Arkansas gravestones and findthegrave.org. One question about those is, are we keeping up? If it was done for Arkansas gravestones by Lynn Baker when he was here in our society, is anybody adding the new burials at this or other cemeteries? You have to think about that. This is quite a remarkable testimony to a community preserving its past and using it into the future. So let me leave you with this. Even though many things about old Arkana have dwindled away, there's still a group of people that have an interest in the legacy of Arkana past, and they have done and are doing what it takes to preserve some of that. The school has been a center of life here, and they did well to bring it back to life. Arkana once was, and now in memory and preservation continues to be a nice little town. Questions?
Yes. Where was the city in relation to this school?
When you go a little past the school, heading down toward Norfolk, and around the curve by the Arkana Baptist Church. Now, I'm going to tell you what I think is the case, and I've talked to Benny about it a little bit, and I don't have it real precise, but there's a road that turns off and goes to the river, and it takes you down. There's a new housing development down in there these days with nice homes and so on. And then you go a little further and you come to what was Bomer's Landing or Arkana Landing. But along that road, and that Bomer house that we looked at here is along that road. And somewhere around the Bomer house was the post office, the stores, and those other businesses that were established in that time.
So they were closer to the river. The town was closer to the river.
It was on the hills above the river. That's kind of what that article over there describes for you a little bit. It's about 2 to 3 miles down to the river from where you turn off the highway there.
They built the school a distance away from it, though, from the town. The school is a distance away from the town.
Yeah, a mile or so. In those days, schools had to be built close enough together that kids could walk to them. And I'm sure. You have any other knowledge of that area, Kevin, to add to this?
Got a lot of students that live back down in there now, since
Yeah.
the development has really took off
Right, there's some,
back in Arkana.
I've driven back in there, some nice roads, and as I drove along the road there, I think with Benny, at one place along there in the timberline, along the fence, there's a really nice rock wall built along there, and I think he said his grandpa built that.
They have at least 2 times and sometimes 3 times a year, they have dinners over there. And we always
Right.
make sure we go. And there's somebody's granny makes these fried pies, and they're absolutely delicious. But anytime you see it in the newspaper, go.
I think
It's
that was
a
old
meal.
Mrs. Thatcher's recipe, probably.
Oh,
But anyway,
Dave, on some of the early maps, and Jeff may know this too, they had the Arkawana.
Arkawana,
Is that different?
I believe Arkawana's up along Highway 5 above Midway,
Okay.
if I'm not mistaken.
Is that right? Because I've seen that on some of the maps.
Jeff is nodding his head, so that makes me feel good, you know. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. I enjoyed researching all that. I know it was a little bit windy, but it started out with wind, you know.
Interesting.